Prepare yourself for a deep dive into an era so impossibly cruel, so utterly shackled by invisible chains, that it will make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Can you believe that for over 300 years, an entire kingdom, the very foundation of modern Britain, was built on a system designed to guarantee that 90% of the population would live and die as nothing more than biological property?
This wasn't some slow, creeping societal decay. This was an economic and social catastrophe no one saw coming, delivered by iron fist and divine decree, creating a nightmare that stretched from the muddy fields of Kent to the windswept moors of Yorkshire.
We are about to enter the feudal system of medieval England, a world where the concept of freedom was not just rare, it was treason. Imagine waking up every single day, knowing that your body, your labor, your children, and even the tiny miserable hut you called home did not belong to you. They belonged to the lord of the manor, and he belonged to the baron, and the baron belonged to the king. It was the ultimate, unbreakable pyramid of power, a structure so meticulously designed that escape was virtually impossible, policed not just by armored knights, but by the very word of God himself. But how did this absolute, suffocating terror take hold? The answer lies in one single, bloody moment in 1066. A date etched in history that didn't just change the ruler of England. It fundamentally obliterated the English way of life forever. When William the Conqueror, a man forged in the brutal fires of Normandy, crossed the Channel and defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings, he didn't just win a battle. He claimed the entire island as his personal spoils of war, triggering the greatest forced redistribution of wealth and power the Western world had ever seen. He looked at the vast green landscape of England and declared, with the unwavering conviction of a zealot, that every single square inch of soil, every forest, every river, every cow, and every breathing human being was now his property, held directly from God. This declaration was the foundation of the feudal system, a revolutionary act of theft that instantly turned thousands of free English farmers into landless, bound tenants, or, to use the chilling historical term, serfs. Before William, there were still pockets of freedom, pockets where men owned their land outright and answered only to themselves. After William, there was only one landowner, the king, and everyone else was merely renting, or, in the case of the serfs, simply existing to serve the person who did the renting. It was a transaction of terror, protection in exchange for absolute submission. The king couldn't possibly manage every scrap of land, so he delegated his absolute power down, creating a terrifying chain of command, known as the Great Chain of Being. At the very top, radiating power and claiming divine sanction, was the king. Below him, the tenants-in-chief, the great barons and lords who swore fealty, a terrifying oath of loyalty, and in return received massive tracts of land known as fiefs. These barons didn't pay taxes in currency. They paid in blood and steel. Their primary obligation was to raise and maintain private armies, to show up whenever the king snapped his fingers and demanded a bloody war against France or Scotland, or even against rival barons. This created a permanently mobilized, militarized society where the ruling class was constantly preparing for conflict, viewing the common people as the inexhaustible resource pool required to feed the engine of war and luxury. The barons, in turn, couldn't manage their vast fiefs alone. They subdivided the land, granting smaller parcels to loyal knights and lesser lords, men who formed the critical middle management of the feudal nightmare. These knights were the shock troopers, the enforcers, men who received land not for agriculture, but for their readiness to kill and die at a moment's notice. They were the visible face of oppression, riding through the villages, ensuring that no serf dared question the boundaries of his miserable existence. And at the very bottom, supporting the entire staggering weight of this heavily armed, divinely sanctioned pyramid, were the serfs. These were not slaves in the classical sense. They could not usually be bought and sold individually, but their bondage was arguably more insidious and permanent. A serf was bound to the land. If the lord sold the manor, the serf went with it, like a fence post or a stubborn rock. They were forbidden from leaving the manor without the lord's express permission, a permission almost never granted, effectively turning the sprawling English countryside into thousands of micro-prisons. Their life was a grueling, relentless cycle of obligation. They had to work the Lord's personal fields, the domain, for 3 days a week, often more during planting and harvest seasons, before they were allowed even a moment to tend to the tiny, often unproductive strips of land allocated for their own family's survival. Then came the fees, the crushing, inescapable taxes levied simply for the crime of existing on the Lord's territory. Want to grind your meager grain harvest into flour? You must use the Lord's mill and pay a hefty toll, or else your crop rots. Need to bake bread? Use the Lord's oven and pay the fee. Did your daughter finally reach marriageable age? You must pay the Lord a staggering tax, the merchet, because technically he owned the reproductive potential of every single person on his land. Every life milestone, every necessity, every breath felt like a taxable event designed to bleed the serf dry, ensuring they always remained on the absolute brink of starvation, thus guaranteeing their utter compliance. This ironclad grip of the feudal system wasn't just economic, it was psychological warfare. The church, the single most powerful ideological force in medieval life, actively reinforced the structure,
preaching that God himself had ordained this three-part society: those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the serfs. To question the king or the lord was not just rebellion against man, it was blasphemy against God. This was the terrifying genius of the system. It didn't rely solely on the sword, but on the soul. It was a world where loyalty was the most expensive currency, where land was power, and where the vast majority of people were sentenced at birth to a life of back-breaking labor, all to sustain the lavish castles and endless wars of a tiny, armored elite. But even this perfect, brutal pyramid of power had cracks. The pressure of war, the whispers of freedom, and one day, the arrival of a devastating biological catastrophe would hit the system so hard that the king's divine right might not be enough to hold the chains together.
Stay with us, because next we reveal the impossible day-to-day horrors of the serf's life, detailing the specific brutal obligations that defined existence on the manor, and revealing how one book, commissioned by William the Conqueror, became the ultimate tool of eternal servitude.
The massive volume lay shut, but the judgment it contained was eternal. The Doomsday Book, that cold, exhaustive tally of every field, every forest, every hearth fire in the newly conquered realm, was not merely a tax record. It was the ultimate, unappealable map of total human captivity, a terrifying, mathematically precise system of obligations that stretched from the throne down to the mud beneath the serf's bare feet. When William's surveyors finally packed their quills and parchment, they left behind a nation where freedom was an ancient, dangerous myth, replaced by the reality of systemic oppression built on ironclad contracts and the threat of catastrophic violence. This system, the feudal pyramid, was a breathtaking masterpiece of control, designed to make resistance statistically impossible, forever locking every soul into its predetermined place. At the very apex, bathed in the divine, unchallengeable light of God's supposed mandate, sat the king, William the Conqueror, the ultimate landlord, the owner of all England. He wasn't just a ruler, he was the source code of all power, distributing land not out of generosity, but as conditional contracts for absolute, violent loyalty and perpetual subservience. The land, now nationalized property of the crown, was parceled out to his loyal allies, the tenants-in-chief, the mighty barons. These men, usually Norman warriors who spilled blood on English soil for William's cause, held massive estates directly from the crown, but their tenure was never secure. Their rent was not coin, but knights. They were obligated to provide a specific, terrifying quota of armored killers whenever the king demanded war or stability. This was the dark engine of the system. Loyalty purchased through the promise of immense wealth, secured by the existential threat of immediate forfeiture if the contract was ever broken or the promised military manpower fell short. The barons, in turn, practiced sub-infeudation, carving up their massive estates into smaller fiefs and passing the crushing military burden down the chain to the professional warrior class, the knights. The knight, the true heavy boot on the neck of the local populace, received the land, a self-contained economic unit called a manor, in exchange for sworn, bloody service to the baron above him. He was the local warlord, the tax collector, and the ultimate judicial authority, living off the compulsive labor of those beneath him. But the true, grinding horror of the feudal system played out daily on the manor, the smallest, most cruel, and most inescapable unit of this entire terrifying experiment in societal control. Here, beneath the knight's ever-watchful eye, lived the vast majority of the population, the serfs, often referred to as villeins. These people were not legally slaves in the Roman sense. They couldn't be bought and sold individually like cattle, but they were something arguably worse. They were irrevocably bound to the very soil.
They were adscripti glebe, forever chained to the land they worked, their existence inseparable from the dirt itself. If the land was sold, granted, or simply passed to a new lord, the serf went with it, an inseparable chattel part of the real estate package, valued only for the labor he could provide.
There was no walking away. There was no desperate attempt to move to the next town for a better opportunity, for the horizon was the hard edge of the Lord's estate. The moment you stepped off it without explicit written permission, you became a runaway, a fugitive, hunted by the knight's men and subject to summary execution or brutal public punishment when caught. Their entire miserable life was defined by the compulsory, soul-crushing obligations demanded by the lord of the manor. The first and most debilitating was week work. For perhaps 3 days every single week, and dedicate his labor entirely to the Lord's own domain. This was the best land on the manor, worked solely for the Lord's profit, guaranteeing the serf spent 3 guaranteed days of forced unpaid labor before he could even begin to think about feeding his own often starving family. This wasn't occasional help. This was a perpetual, systemic theft of time and energy, ensuring the serf could never truly get ahead. And that was just the baseline requirement for survival. When the Lord needed extra help for the crucial harvest or the demanding planting seasons, the serf was called up for boon work. Additional, often unpaid, mandatory labor that could last days or even weeks during the most economically demanding times of the year. This crucial forced service inevitably prevented the serf from maximizing the yield from his own meager holdings, ensuring that he perpetually hovered just above the line of starvation, always dependent on the Lord's grudging permission to live. But the true genius of the oppression lay in the systematic extraction of wealth through fines and monopolies,
turning every essential life function into a taxable event for the Lord, ensuring he profited from basic human needs.
Need to grind your grain into flour? Forget your own stones. The Lord maintained a complete, unyielding monopoly on the mill. You were forced, under threat of severe penalty and often the destruction of your own grinding tools, to use the Lord's mill, paying a hefty multure, a substantial portion of your already meager grain, just for the privilege of making bread. The same applied to baking. You used the Lord's communal oven, paid the Lord's fee, or faced the consequences.
If your daughter wished to marry, particularly if she intended to marry someone from a neighboring manor, a necessary evil to prevent local inbreeding and keep the population viable, you had to pay the merchant. This was a significant fine paid to the Lord for the loss of one of his laborers, the daughter, and for the audacity of making independent family arrangements without his financial consent.
And when death finally arrived, even that provided no escape from the Lord's grasping fingers. Upon the death of the head of the household, the family was required to pay the Harriet, a tax that demanded handing over the serf's single best beast.
This was often the only ox or cow they possessed, an animal absolutely vital for plowing their own land and planting the next year's crop. This cruel final act of extraction often left the grieving family instantly impoverished, guaranteeing that the cycle of debt, labor, and dependence would continue unbroken for the next generation.
This was the cold, hard, inescapable bedrock of medieval life. Not freedom or opportunity, but a meticulously calculated, divinely justified economic servitude, codified in cold ink by the Domesday Book and enforced by the ever-present shadow of the night's steel. The soil beneath their feet was not a home, it was the floor of their permanent, inherited prison.
The ink of the Domesday Book was still wet, yet the true horror was already unfolding on the mud-slicked paths of 1,000 manors. The grand architecture of oppression was complete, and now it was time for the foundational stones, the serfs, to bear the impossible weight of the entire structure.
These were the villains, the vast, anonymous majority whose lives were not measured by ambition or freedom, but by the relentless, grinding cycle of obligation enforced by the Lord's steward, a man whose word was often more final than the king's decree itself. The average serf awoke not to the promise of a new day, but to the crushing certainty of corvée, the mandated, non-negotiable labor service that dictated every waking moment.
Imagine giving 3 days of every week, not to your own survival, not to the planting of your meager strip of land, but directly to the Lord's domain. This was mandatory servitude, a time tax levied upon the very existence of the peasant, ensuring that the wealth and leisure of the barons were literally built on the sweat and shattered backs of the poor.
But the regular 3-day toll was just the beginning of this inescapable economic terror. When the harvest ripened, that crucial make-or-break moment for the Lord's profit, the serf was called upon for boon work. This was emergency labor, often lasting days or weeks, forcing the serf to abandon his own fields entirely during the most critical time of the year, ensuring that the Lord's grain was gathered, dried, and stored, while the serf's own crops often rotted in the field, waiting for attention that would never come.
It was a chilling calculus of survival. The Lord's abundance was guaranteed by the serf's risk of famine, a system designed to keep the laborer perpetually on the knife edge of desperation, never quite starving, but never daring to rise above destitution.
The system needed more than just labor. It needed blood money, a constant, humiliating drain of every resource the peasant might gather. This was where the taxes of the manor truly became instruments of psychological torture and total financial castration.
There was the tallage, a tax so arbitrary, so brazenly unfair, that it embodied the Lord's divine right to simply take what he wished. It was often demanded at will, fluctuating with the needs or whims of the baron, leaving the serf with no stability or predictability in his finances. But the most insidious controls were those that reached into the most intimate parts of the serf's existence, proving that their bodies, their marriages, and even their deaths belonged entirely to the Lord.
Consider the merchet, the marriage tax. If a serf's son or daughter wished to marry someone from outside the manor, or sometimes even inside, they had to pay a substantial fee to the Lord for permission.
Why? Because marrying off manor meant the Lord lost a potential laborer, a valuable piece of chattel, and that loss had to be compensated in coin. This rule made personal choice an economic crime, turning love and family into commodities owned by the aristocracy. And then the final crushing indignity, the Harriet. When a serf died, the Lord claimed the best beast of burden, the best cow, the strongest ox, from the serf's impoverished estate. This wasn't merely a tax, it was the ultimate act of extraction, ensuring that the family he left behind was instantly weakened, making their struggle to survive the next winter exponentially harder. Death did not bring release, it brought ruin to the living. This entire suffocating web of obligations was enforced not by distant royal decree, but by the terrifying immediacy of the manor court. This was the true engine of feudal control, a chamber of echoes and arbitrary despair, presided by the Lord's steward. This court was not a venue for justice. It was an instrument for the collection of fines and the maintenance of absolute obedience. Every trivial dispute, every failure to perform work properly, every alleged trespass, it all ended here, generating a steady stream of revenue for the Lord and keeping the serf paralyzed by fear. A serf could be fined for letting his pigs wander into the wrong field, for failing to repair a fence on time, or simply for speaking out of turn. The fines were rarely small enough to be dismissed, often requiring the sale of some vital possession, pulling the family further down into the spiral of debt and dependency.
The legal fiction was complete. The serf was adscriptus sclebe, bound to the soil. He could not leave. He could not seek better fortune. And he could not escape the endless cycle of labor and arbitrary taxation.
If a serf dared to flee, they became an outlaw, hunted by the lord's bailiffs. Even if they managed to escape to a chartered town, the lord had the right to drag them back within a year and a day, proving to everyone that the ground they stood on was merely the floor of their inherited prison, with walls made of steel and the crushing weight of systemic inevitability.
The terrible conclusion, the realization that inherited prison was the only legacy left, was immediately followed by the terrifying systematization of that very despair. It wasn't enough for William the Conqueror to seize the crown. He had to re-engineer the very soul of the land, replacing the fragile freedoms of Saxon law with a perfect, deadly machine designed for total control.
This new reality crystallized into a stark geometric shape, the feudal pyramid, a monument to total, crushing societal hierarchy built entirely upon the broken backs of the English populace. Every single person, from the highest-ranking baron to the lowest mud-caked serf, had a precise, inescapable vertical location within this structure, a designated box from which escape was not merely difficult, but practically treason against the established divine order.
This was not a social ladder you could climb through hard work or ambition. It was a societal vice, tightening perpetually, ensuring that power, wealth, and legal authority flowed exclusively from the tip, the king, who claimed ultimate ownership of every single square inch of British soil, the fountainhead of all jurisdiction and title. Below the monolithic king stood the mighty tenants-in-chief, the great barons, earls, and powerful bishops, men who had fought tooth and nail for William at Hastings and were now rewarded with staggering tracts of land, known as fiefs. These men were the true warlords of the new regime, the Iron Fist clad in velvet. But even these titans were trapped, bound by the very system that elevated them. They didn't truly own the land in the sense we understand today. They held it in tenure, directly from the king, a lease contingent entirely upon their absolute and unwavering loyalty, and crucially, upon the performance of specific, often backbreaking, military duties. They were the king's primary war chiefs, obligated not just to show up for battle, but to supply the crown with a predetermined number of fully armored knights, trained and ready for immediate deployment, a constant, crushing tax, measured not in silver, but in human life and polished steel. The essential, almost magical ingredient that held this lethal arrangement together wasn't just law, but the sacred, terrifying ritual of homage and the oath of fealty. Imagine the scene: a great hall, torches flickering, casting dramatic shadows across cold Norman stone, as the powerful baron knelt, stripped of his armor and pride, before the enthroned king. This was the moment of absolute, formalized submission, a religious spectacle designed to reinforce the terror of disobedience. The Baron would place his hands together between the kings, uttering the sacred promise, swearing to be the king's man for the rest of his natural life, loyal in all things, serving him against any and all foes, foreign or domestic. This was a contract written in eternal ink, witnessed by God Himself and the saints, a spiritual chain that was considered unbreakable, turning mere land agreements into matters of eternal salvation or damnation, ensuring that the greatest lords were mentally and spiritually enslaved to the crown. But the chain of command and the web of obligation did not stop there. The tenants-in-chief, needing to fulfill their own extensive military and financial obligations, carved up their vast fiefs and granted smaller parcels to lesser lords, knights, and gentlemen, known as mez tenants, or sometimes simply vassals. This process, known as sub-infeudation, created a dizzying, complex, and highly dangerous web of nested loyalties, a legal labyrinth where every single lord in the kingdom was simultaneously a demanding master to those below him and a sworn servant to the Lord above. It was not uncommon for one single man to owe military service and financial aid to 3 or 4 different lords for 3 or 4 different pieces of land, creating a nightmarish legal landscape where conflicting duties and overlapping jurisdictions could, and often did, erupt into bloody, localized warfare overnight, far from the king's watchful eye. The core principle unifying this massive structure remained terrifyingly simple and brutally effective. No man, not even the richest duke, owned his land absolutely. All land was ultimately held of the king. This concept, the theory of tenures, was the ultimate mechanism of royal control, the invisible lever of power. If a lord failed in his duty, if he failed to supply the required number of knights, if he committed an act of treason, or even if he simply failed to produce an acceptable adult male heir, that land, that entire slice of established wealth and power, escheated or reverted back directly to the king, becoming crown property once more. The existential threat of complete forfeiture hung like the legendary sword of Damocles over every single nobleman's head, ensuring compliance and diligence through perpetual, agonizing insecurity, confirming that the Norman system was not built on trust, but on fear. And at the very, very bottom, supporting the crushing weight of this entire glittering, bloody structure, were the serfs and villains, the English majority. For them, the introduction of the new Norman system only solidified their status as human fixtures of the landscape, legally defined not as men, but as property attached to the soil. They were not slaves in the classical Roman sense, but they were bound to the manor, the land, for life, legally forbidden from leaving the estate, ever, without the lord's express and almost always costly permission to purchase their freedom, which was rarely granted. Their entire dismal existence was defined by the corvée, the forced labor they owed the Lord,
3 days a week, sometimes more, they were required to work the Lord's domain, the land reserved exclusively for the Lord's direct profit, before they could even begin to touch the meager, scattered strips of land allotted to feed their own starving families. The oppression was meticulously institutionalized, manifesting through countless fees and crippling obligations known as feudal incidents. Did a serf harvest his meager grain? He was legally compelled to use the Lord's mill, paying a hefty multure fee, ensuring the Lord profited from the very sustenance necessary for the peasant's survival.
Did the serf's daughter wish to marry a man from a neighboring village? A marquette fee was ruthlessly demanded, a literal tax on the lord's lost property, punishing the family for the departure of a woman and her potential future labor.
But the most brutal, the most soul-crushing of all, was the Harriet, the infamous death tax. When the head of the serf family died, the lord had the undisputed right to seize the best beast, the best piece of furniture, or the best chattel the family owned. The moment of deepest grief was also the moment of greatest financial devastation, ensuring the next generation started their miserable lives with less than nothing.
This entire edifice, from the royal oath of fealty to the peasant's desperate death tax, was deliberately constructed not just to extract wealth, but to eliminate the very possibility of self-determination, autonomy, or hope. The serf was born into the Lord's jurisdiction, lived under the Lord's summary justice in the manorial court, and died, leaving his final possessions to the Lord, completing the terrifying cycle.
This was a cycle of poverty and servitude so complete, so perfectly engineered, that the only thing separating the peasant from the earth he tilled was the thin layer of mud coating his worn boots. The feudal system was the architectural masterpiece of the medieval world, but its grand design was the construction of a self-sustaining, multi-tiered prison, where every chain was forged in the fire of assumed divine right.
The chains of this magnificent prison, built on the bedrock of Norman steel, did not stop at the baron's towering castle gates. Oh no. The true genius of the feudal system, the terrifying mechanism that ensured total, systemic control, was its ability to cascade downwards, forcing every layer to become both ruler and enslaved simultaneously.
The tenants-in-chief, the barons, were only high-ranking prisoners themselves, constantly staring at the executioner's axe held by the king. They had received their immense fiefdoms, but that land came with a ledger of deathly serious obligations that had to be fulfilled, or their entire world would instantly dissolve.
They were required, first and foremost, to perform homage and fealty. This was not a friendly handshake between peers. This was a soul-binding ritual, a sacred terror designed to break the will of the subordinate before the ink was even dry on the contract. Imagine the scene. The powerful baron, the man who commanded armies and built fortresses, kneeling publicly before his king, hands clasped and placed between the hands of the sovereign,
uttering the terrifying words, "I become your man."
This declaration, this physical act of submission, meant the vassal was surrendering his future, his dignity, and his very life into the hands of his lord. It was a contractual relationship rooted in a total spiritual subservience that transcended mere politics and became a quasi-religious covenant.
But the king didn't need pretty words. He needed bodies. The most critical obligation tied to the baronial lands was military service. The great barons were required to furnish a specific number of fully equipped knights, the infamous knight's fee, ready to fight the moment the king sounded the war horn. This service was usually set at 40 days per year, free of charge, a massive commitment of resources, training, and logistics. Failure to meet this levy was not merely a breach of contract, it was treason, punishable by the immediate, devastating forfeiture of the land that defined their existence. But the barons, despite their vast estates, could not possibly patrol and manage every acre while simultaneously training a standing army of dozens of knights. The weight of this obligation led to the system's terrifying replication, sub-infeudation.
The baron, to fulfill his quota for the king, was forced to carve up his own massive land grant and grant smaller parcels, manors, to his own vassals, the lesser lords and knights. He became the lord, and the recipients became his vassals, recreating the exact same terrifying contract, just one rung lower. This created a labyrinthine, fractal pyramid of loyalty and obligation. The knight who received a manor from the baron now owed the baron military service, just as the baron owed the king. This ingenious design ensured that every single piece of land, from the coastline to the deepest forest wood, was inextricably linked to military duty and the maintenance of the Norman regime. Land was not property in the modern sense. It was a conditional loan, a temporary currency that was permanently conditional upon service. If the knight failed the baron suffered. If the baron failed the king, the entire structure trembled. The system was a continuous, high-stakes game of pass the parcel, where the parcel contained the immediate threat of destitution and death. And while the king primarily demanded military might, over time, a new, far more insidious weapon was introduced into the financial arsenal: scutage. Scutage, or shield money, was the king's brilliant and brutally pragmatic innovation. Instead of demanding 40 days of actual, sweaty, expensive military service, the king began demanding a cash payment equivalent to what that service would cost. Why? Because sometimes the king preferred paid, professional mercenaries who could fight for longer than 40 days, or perhaps he needed to fund a diplomatic mission or pay off a debt. Suddenly, the land-based economy of feudalism was contaminated by the introduction of hard currency, turning the system into a ruthless debt collector. The barons and knights, locked into a system where cash was notoriously scarce, were often forced to bleed their own tenants and serfs dry to raise the required funds for scutage. The financial squeeze on the lords became an unbearable, suffocating weight on the peasantry. The terror wasn't just physical, it was financial. The iron grip of the king now reached directly into the meager coin purse of the lowliest tenant, demanding payment for wars they would never fight and victories they would never celebrate. Scutage weaponized peacetime. Even when the battlefield was quiet, the financial obligations were relentless, ensuring the flow of wealth always traveled uphill, sustaining the monarch's vast ambition. This was the operational reality of the middle tier, a constant, high-pressure existence defined by oaths, service, and the ever-present threat of forfeiture. They were the linchpins, the critical infrastructure that converted the king's theoretical power into actual, inescapable control over every acre of English earth, establishing a societal machine designed for total and perpetual extraction. The machine was built. The steel gears of Norman oppression were finally greased with the sweat of the English peasantry, and the sound they made was the slow, rhythmic grinding of human liberty being crushed. But how exactly did this monstrous system extract every single drop of value, ensuring the king and his barons grew impossibly wealthy, while the rest starved? It wasn't enough to simply own the land. The Norman lords had to own the people on it. This is where the terrifying reality of villeinage, the inescapable, inherited servitude, slammed into the lives of 3/4 of the population. They were the engine of the entire economy, and their existence was defined by obligations so crushing they redefined the very meaning of the word unfreedom. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that the sun, the rain, the very breath in your lungs did not truly belong to you. Your labor was not yours. Your children were not guaranteed freedom. You were, quite literally, tied to the soil, a human chattel bound by the terrifying concept of glebe adscripti, meaning attached to the land. This wasn't chattel slavery, which traded people like cattle, but it was a nuanced, agonizing form of servitude designed to be perpetual and hereditary. The serf, or villain, received a small, fragmented strip of land, just enough to starve slowly if the crops failed, in exchange for a horrific, non-negotiable list of mandatory duties. These were the corvée, the forced labor obligations that dominated their existence and ensured they lived on the razor's edge of survival. They owed the lord of the manor specific days every single week, typically 2 or 3, dedicated entirely to working the domain, the massive tract of land reserved exclusively for the baron's profit. This essential labor was non-negotiable, often performed at the most critical, back-breaking times of the agricultural calendar, planting and harvest. The barons, masters of efficiency and cruelty, operated under the principle of priority. If the lord needed extra hands during the crunch, say, the sudden threat of rain during the wheat harvest, the serf had to drop whatever they were doing on their own pitiful strips and rush instantly to the domain.
This wasn't merely work. It was a constant, unpredictable, and exhausting drain of time and energy, ensuring the serf never, ever got ahead, guaranteeing the Lord profited first, always. It was a zero-sum game, engineered for perpetual peasant loss.
But the physical labor was only half the nightmare. The barons, being excellent accountants of misery, devised a series of fees that turned every major life event, every milestone, into a costly, taxable liability that drained any potential savings.
Want to marry? You needed the Lord's explicit permission, and you paid dearly for it, a levy known universally as mershet. This was especially crucial if the serf dared to marry someone from outside the manor, because the Lord certainly didn't want his valuable, laboring resource walking away to benefit a rival feudal lord.
Even worse, more chilling, was the dreaded Harriot. When a serf finally died, finally escaping the crushing drudgery of the fields, the Lord did not offer condolences. Instead, the Lord demanded the best beast, ox, cow, or horse the family owned, or sometimes their best possession.
Imagine the devastating scene, a family grieving their loss, the patriarch laid out, only for the Lord's bailiff to arrive, pointing a greedy finger at the only plow animal they had left. It was a brutal tax on death itself, a mechanism designed to ensure generational poverty and prevent the accumulation of any wealth whatsoever. And where could a desperate serf turn when the demands became unbearable? To the law? The law was the Lord. Justice was administered in the manorial court, a terrifying tribunal presided over by the Lord's steward, an official whose primary loyalty was to the extraction machine, not to fairness or equity. The serf had virtually no standing against the Lord in the king's common law courts regarding his land tenure. His tenure was based entirely on the custom of the manor, a vague, shifting rulebook which the Lord could interpret with frightening, self-serving flexibility. The difference between a true free tenant who paid rent and a serf who paid in labor and obligations was legally technical, but existentially vast. The free tenant had access to the king's courts to protect his holding. The serf did not. He was entirely at the mercy of the baron's local jurisdiction, trapped in a legal cage. If a serf dared to flee the manor, a desperate act of rebellion against the system, they were legally hunted, branded as fugitives. There was only one terrifying, slender loophole. If they managed to hide in a chartered town for 1 year and a day without being discovered and claimed by the Lord's agents, only then could they potentially earn freedom. This small, terrifying chance of escape kept the dream of liberty alive. But for the vast majority, the constant, grinding legal insecurity meant the serf lived in a state of perpetual psychological terror. They were not citizens. They were cogs. They were property, defined by their forced service, their very identity erased beneath the weight of their unending obligations. The system of extraction perfected by the Normans was absolute, encompassing land, labor, life, marriage, and death. It was a suffocating, comprehensive social order where true freedom was merely a whispered, dangerous legend, kept alive only by the occasional flicker of defiance that usually ended swiftly and brutally back on the Lord's cold, damp soil, confirming that in feudal England the earth was both your provider and your eternal, merciless jailer.
The earth was a jailer, and the key to the cell was time itself. The most precious resource the serf would never, ever own. Every dawn broke not as a promise of life, but as a chilling reminder of the debt they owed. A debt payable in sweat, blood, and the utter consumption of their fleeting years. For the average serf, freedom was a forgotten legend, replaced by the crushing reality of weak work. This was the mandatory, non-negotiable labor due to the lord of the manor, typically demanding 3 days of their already short week, sometimes more, depending on the local custom and the lord's sheer greed.
Think of it: Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, dedicated entirely to tilling the Lord's private domain, the domain, ensuring that the wealth machine kept turning, regardless of their own family's starving patch of ground and the urgent needs of their own survival. They watched their own small strips of land wither while they poured their last energy into ensuring the abundance of the manorial barn. This wasn't just labor. It was systematic confiscation of their opportunity, a deliberate act of ensuring their constant, desperate dependency. But the weak work was only the steady, miserable hum of tyranny. The true spikes of terror came during the boon work, the sudden, unpredictable demands for intensive labor during critical, back-breaking periods like harvest, planting, and plowing. When the Lord needed the crops in, the serf dropped everything. Their own miserable harvest could rot in the field, their family's survival potentially risked, because the Lord's yield, the foundation of the entire oppressive pyramid, took absolute, terrifying precedence over every other human concern. This was the system weaponizing necessity, twisting the natural cycle of the seasons into a whip used to drive the peasantry past exhaustion and into the grave. The harvest was not a celebration. It became a terrifying, grueling race against the clock and the Lord's cruel, often armed, overseers. The serf was a tool, an engine of agricultural production, and the constant demand for both weak work and boon work guaranteed that the only thing they had left for their own fields was exhaustion, despair, and the scraps of a dying day. If the loss of their time wasn't enough, the feudal machine extracted wealth at every imaginable juncture, transforming basic human rights and fundamental life events into taxable offenses. This was where the tyranny became truly insulting, a constant, vicious reminder of their subhuman status. First came the tallage. This was the arbitrary tax, often demanded when the lord felt the need for extra coin. Perhaps he was buying new armor, funding a useless war, or simply throwing a lavish feast. It was a payment subject to no fixed rule or appeal, simply a declaration of absolute divine power. I need it, therefore you must pay it. They were forced to pay for the privilege of living under a ruler who provided nothing but the constant threat of violence. But the most invasive and humiliating fees reached deep into the sacred heart of the family unit, controlling the peasant's life from birth to death, ensuring that freedom was a financial impossibility. Imagine having to pay your master simply for the right to marry. This was the crushing reality of Machet, the fee paid to the lord when a serf's daughter married, particularly if she married outside the confines of the manor's territory. The rationale was brutally simple, a testament to the serf's status as chattel. The lord was losing a piece of property, a potential future laborer and childbearer. He demanded compensation for the loss of future productivity and the lineage he claimed. This wasn't romance or familial ceremony. It was a transaction involving livestock, love, lineage, and the formation of a new family were strictly regulated business agreements, dictated by the ruling class, binding the next generation before they were even born. And the final, agonizing insult came at death, ensuring that the cycle of deprivation restarted immediately. This was the Harriet. Before the body was even cold, before the tears had dried, the Lord's representative would arrive to claim the best possession of the deceased. They took the best cow, the only decent plow, the few precious tools, or maybe the father's only warm cloak. This final act of confiscation was meticulously designed to ensure that the serf class could never, under any circumstances, accumulate intergenerational wealth.
The Harriet prevented any vestige of upward mobility, violently locking the remaining family back into grinding, existential destitution. The system ensured that no matter how hard you worked, how many years you survived the plague or the famine, your life ended with a final, definitive theft.
They lived under a crushing trinity of control. The Lord owned their time, week work and boon work. He controlled their family, Merchet, and he confiscated their potential wealth, Harriot and tallage. The feudal system was a masterclass in total, systemic suffocation. It wasn't merely poverty. It was a scientifically managed mechanism designed to extract the maximum possible value from a human being, while leaving them just enough life force to continue the cycle for the next generation. The invisible chains of law, custom, and debt were far stronger than any iron manacle, creating a terrifyingly stable machine built on the bedrock of fear, divine decree, and the simple, undeniable power of the sword. The serf was the eternal, renewable fuel. The serf was the eternal, renewable fuel. But even fuel needs a container, a strict boundary to prevent the fire from spreading out of control. That container was not the castle wall, nor the deep freezing moat, but the law itself, a labyrinth of suffocating rules enforced not by royal decree in Westminster, but right there in the muddy, pungent heart of the village. This was the terrifying jurisdiction of the manorial court. Picture the scene. The Lord's bailiff, a man whose breath smelled of cheap ale and inherited power, standing before a hastily assembled group of shackled villagers. This court was the ultimate instrument of terror, blurring the lines between legislative, executive, and judicial power with chilling efficiency. The Lord, or his often brutal representative, was the law, the final arbiter of existence for everyone beneath him. He judged trespass, settled petty debts, and, most crucially, enforced the ironclad rules of serfdom with zero tolerance for defiance. This was the place where a serf might face punishment for failing to complete his corvée duty, or for simply allowing his cow to graze on the wrong patch of marginal land. The consequences were swift and catastrophic. A simple argument over a pig might end in a fine that consumed a year's worth of meager savings. A minor transgression, like cutting wood from the Lord's reserved forest, could result in the complete confiscation of what little property the serf possessed, erasing months of back-breaking labor in a single cold decree.